With time, tastes change. What is considered canon shifts with the generations, great albums slip from memory, newer records take their place. A recent example of this was Apple Music releasing their list of the top 100 best albums of all time. Lists like this are markers of the current consensus on taste. They also start conversations and arguments about inclusion and exclusion, who is ranked where and why. This is all interesting in of itself, but what was most interesting to me was what the changes meant and what they may tell us about where music and music criticism may be headed. For a comparison, I will use the top 100 albums on Rolling Stone's list of the top 500 albums they compiled in 2003. Why this list? Rolling Stone is considered by most to be the journal of mainstream music criticism in the United States. Using the list from 2003 and not the 2009 or 2020 update will give us a generational comparison when comparing the Rolling Stone list to the Apple Music list. I'm also going to take a look at the number one ranked record, The Miseducation of Lauryn HIll by, you guessed it, Lauryn Hill, give my opinion on the music, and then look at why this record may have been chosen as the number one record of all time by Apple Music. A note. I'm not a musician, music journalist, or critic. I'm not a writer by trade. I consider myself a music fan, but probably not to the same extent I once was. These are just my, admittedly, amateur opinions. With that out of the way, what jumps out to me when comparing these two lists? If you look at the top 100 as a whole, there's not as much churn as you may have thought. About a third of the Apple 100 picks are on both lists. Given the fact that Apple believes that 25% of the best music of all time was released on or after 2003, when the Rolling Stone list was released, this is pretty impressive. The biggest takeaway is probably in genre. By my count, there are 12 hip-hop records on the Apple list that were released between 1988 and 1998 that are not on the Rolling Stone list. We also see a total of 10 records by contemporary pop stars, those with records made after 2003. This doesn't count albums by Jay-Z, Eminem, Kanye West, Travis Scott, or Tyler, the Creator. Who filled these slots on the Rolling Stone list? Mostly British invasion bands, their earlier American influences, Elvis, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Ray Charles, etc., and Bob Dylan. All told, they took, by my count, roughly 34% of that list. If you took the average year released for both lists, there is less than a 20-year difference, with the average year of the 2003 list being 1973 and the Apple list being 1991. It is important to note that this is not completely true, however. We have to remember that some of the Rolling Stone albums are compilations of an artist's body of work that is sometimes decades older than the release date. For instance, Muddy Waters, the anthology, contains some songs that were recorded 50 years before the 2001 release of that album. The Apple list gets a lot younger when looking at the top 10. The average year released for the top 10 for the Apple Music list is 1995, while the average year released from Rolling Stone is 1968, a 27-year gap. Most of this is due to the concentration of Beatles records, a band that broke up more than 50 years ago. 4 of their albums are in the top 10, with 3 being in the top 5. As I mentioned earlier, the top 100 of the Rolling Stone list is part of a larger 500 albums list. I believe this gave them the opportunity to acknowledge records that may have less broad appeal, but still have very high quality. Because the Apple list is only 100 albums, I believe there is more of a pressure to, for the most part, give out awards to major artists or albums representative of genres in a more or less egalitarian fashion, which made the range much broader in terms of when these records were released. If, for instance, Apple had decided that Beyoncé was the most important musician and the top 10 of their list looked like this: number 1, Lemonade, Beyoncé 2016. Number 2, Miseducation of Lauryn HIll by Lauryn Hill 1998. Number 3, 4, Beyoncé 2011. Number 4, Thriller, Michael Jackson 1982. Number 5, I Am Sasha Fierce, Beyoncé 2008. Number 6, Abbey Road, Beatles 1969. Number 7, Purple Rain, Prince 1984. Number 8, Blonde by Frank Ocean 2016. Number 9, Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder 1976. And number 10, Renaissance, Beyoncé 2022. The average year of a release for the top 10 would be 1998. Before we move on, a word from our sponsor. Do you enjoy reading but can't find book reviewers you connect with? Do you find booktubers more concerned with showing off their book hauls than reading to be as useful as solar-powered flashlights? You may enjoy another book review. It's a spoiler-free book review channel where I review everything from contemporary literature to classics, genre fiction such as sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, as well as a large dose of nonfiction. If you loved reading as a kid but fell out of the habit and are looking to jump back in, or if you never left in the first place, you'll find something to enjoy. That's Another Book Review on youtube.com. That's not the list that we got, however. I wanted to understand why the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill took the top spot on the Apple list. First, obviously, I had to listen to it. As a general rule, I don't criticize anything without experiencing it, so for the first time, I listened to the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Now, I'm 40 years old, and my hearing is not what it once was, so you should probably take any criticism I have with a grain of salt. Though you should do this with every criticism. Are you a sheep? I also probably haven't really gotten into a record for 5 or so years. Maybe this is because I've reached the end of the period where I can add new things to the list of things that I like, or maybe I just haven't been exposed to anything that I find truly new or exciting or different. I think it becomes harder to find the time to search for new things when it seems like new things were always there when I was younger. It's a lot easier to go fishing when the fish just leap into your boat. While I probably have a few hundred CDs, 100 or so records, plus maybe a couple dozen of iTunes albums, I'm certainly past the point in my life where music is a primary focus of my identity and is not nearly the same focal point for me that it once was. I wanted to listen to the whole record to make up my own fair opinion of it. I heard the lead single, Doo-Wop, That Thing, a ton when it first came out and always liked it. I've heard snippets of Everything is Everything, and I knew that it came from this album, but had never listened to the record all the way through, so my knowledge of the album was relatively minimal. Also, it should be noted that the following review is based on my listening to the whole record exactly once, on YouTube, through headphones connected to my laptop speakers, so if you're an audiophile who has loved this record for 25 years, don't take in me. So, with all that being said, do I think the record should have the number one spot on this list? In short, no. But I also believe, having listened to the record all the way through, that I'm closer to understanding why it was chosen as number one. First, the good stuff. There are a handful of standout tracks, Doo-Wop That Thing, Final Hour, and the D'Angelo-assisted Nothing Even Matters, where the vocal interplay and chemistry between the two gets you 90% of the way to something truly memorable, are, in my opinion, head and shoulders above the rest of the album. It's impossible to talk about the record without talking about Lauryn Hill herself. To state the obvious, Lauryn Hill can sing. I don't think she's quite Whitney or Mariah, but she's certainly at least on the level of Adele, who through sheer will, some talent, and a lot of mum makeover energy, has willed her way into apparently a spot on lists like this for 21 moving forward, but I digress. Some of the melodies from Miseducation stick in your head. I'm reminded of the chorus that Lauryn sings at the end of Lost Ones is a good example of this. I like there are different moods on Miseducation, though I think, listening to the record in 2024, to call it adventurous is a Mr. Fantastic level stretch. There are bits of rock guitar here and there, some reggae and bad accents, hip-hop sprinkles, doo-wop and soul elements, mostly in the call and response backing vocals, and some Stevie Wonder-esque funk, but most of the record would not have seemed out of place if Sheryl Crow or Alanis Morissette had sung over these same musical beds in the mid-90s. Before I go into the parts that didn't work for me, let's talk about the backstory of this record. This record was lauded when it came out in ways that went beyond the actual quality of the music. One reason was the story behind it. Lauryn Hill had gone solo after being a member of the Fugees, which had released the score just 2 years prior. This was a hugely successful record, which Hill references on her song The Final Hour. The album was also promoted as being a singular creation of Hill, and there is a long, contentious history about who did what on this record. From a 1998 article in the Los Angeles Times entitled The Legal Tangle of Miseducation, Jeff Boucher writes, on the eve of the Grammy season, in which it is a sure contender, the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill is being portrayed in a lawsuit filed by a group of musicians as something far different, a group project and a lesson in the unfairness of the music business. The musicians, known collectively as New Arc, are suing Hill and her label in U.S. District Court in Newark, New Jersey, claiming they deserve a share of songwriting or production credit on 13 of the album's 14 songs, and, of course, a sizable chunk of the profits generated by the album, which has sold 2.4 million copies to date. Editor's note, per Complex magazine, that number is closer to 30 million copies sold worldwide as of 2023. The album credits say the album is produced, written, and arranged by Hill, and she is also listed as executive producer on all the tracks. The Newark musicians, Vada Nobles, Rashim Kilo Pugh, and twin brothers Johari and Tujamold Newton, are acknowledged several times for additional production, additional music contribution, and additional lyric contribution on some songs. They claim, however, to be the primary songwriters on 2 tracks, Nothing Really Matters and Everything is Everything, and major contributors on 6 others. Full or partial production credit is also due to the team on 5 tracks, the suit claims. The musicians also claim to have made sizable uncredited production contributions to A Rose is Still a Rose, a song Hill produced for Aretha Franklin's last album. They eventually settled this lawsuit, and per Wikipedia, there are 3 songs where Hill split songwriting credits and 2 songs with co-producers listed. Why does this matter? Psychology today defines parasocial relationships as one-sided relationships in which a person develops a strong sense of connection, intimacy, or familiarity with someone they don't know, most often celebrities or media personalities. In a similar vein to Adele's stories of pain a decade or so later, people, I believe, latched onto this record in part because of the voyeuristic aspect of someone dealing with heartbreak and betrayal in the public eye. Some of the songs on Miseducation are believed to be about Wyclef Jean, her former bandmate, and the dissolution of their romantic relationship. This is probably most direct on the first track, Lost Ones. I think women, especially, flock to stories of women done wrong or those who have been stepped on by the music industry due to sexism. Part of that story was reinforced when there was a push to make the story of the record as a creation of Hill and Hill alone. The music industry has a long and shameful history, even putting aside cultural appropriation of mostly black artists by white artists and record labels, of stealing credit and assigning it to others for commercial purposes. Milli Vanilli, CNC Music Factory, and scores of others have miscredited creators in order to uphold the image of a singular genius using their heightened emotions, usually pain and suffering, to create beautiful art they couldn't have otherwise made. Was this true of Hill? I wasn't there, so I have no real idea of what Hill did or didn't do. We live in an extremely litigious society where lawsuits are oftentimes the first source of remedy instead of being the last to any disagreement. This is also the music business where the definition of written and copyrighted are mostly left up to lawyers to hash out after the project has proved successful enough for those involved to hire them. So, what on this record did Hill do? I'll get more into my uninformed opinions about how much she did a little later. The album went on to win 5 Grammys, which was a record for both hip-hop and women in a single night. Its only real competition for Album of the Year was Ray of Light by Madonna and Come On Over by Shania Twain, though Miseducation was much more well received by critics at the time. I went over the parts of the record I liked. Here's what I thought could have been done better. The album is long, like later period Martin Scorsese long. Some of this is due to interstitial skits in which a teacher asks a room full of middle or high school age kids their feelings on love, but also because the songs, on average, go on for probably 10 to 20% longer than they should. It contains some of the worst indulgences of 1990s pop music. Skits, album bloat. The album is nearly 80 minutes long with a ton of filler tracks, using the same generic record scratch sound on multiple songs, interpolating other better music instead of coming up with new original ideas. Carlos Santana, the list could go on. The music itself on the record leaves a lot to be desired. How to describe this? Generic? Bland? Humorless? Yes. Lauryn Hill has a beautiful singing voice, but she's not a particularly inspiring lyricist, and even the songs where she is at her most personal, Every Ghetto, Every City, Lost Ones, don't bring anything new or interesting to childhood reminiscing or heartbreak, respectively. The trite lyrics are throughout and didn't connect with me emotionally. There's also a reliance on biblical and historical allusions that wore on me pretty quickly. Your own mileage may vary. When she's rapping, she sometimes digs deeper. Final Hour was the most pleasant surprise on this album. It's a dope hip-hop track. The beat is nice, and Lauryn's most inspired, wittiest lyrics are found here. While we're on the subject, there have been 2 Album of the Year Grammys winners that have been hip-hop artists, Lauryn Hill and Outkast. That's it. Here's the thing. This record really is not a hip-hop record. If you get into technicalities, you can make the argument, I guess, but it's a bit like making the argument that an Oreo is a sandwich. You may be technically correct, but most people would reject that label because there's a more accurate description of the thing we're talking about. Now, in an alternate universe where there were 10 tracks as good as Final Hour, Lauryn Hill would be MF Doom, Nas level great, but that's not this record. The record we did get has compositions that are sparser than I thought they would be given the amount of press at the time regarding the genre hopping, genre mixing. There isn't a level of lushness to most of the tracks to compare it to, say, Title by Fiona Apple, which had come out a few years earlier. That record was both angrier and less spiritual than Miseducation, so that may have been part of the dissonance there. So, what do I think Lauryn Hill actually did on this record? Part of what makes this record interesting is its genre. Usually in hip-hop, there's a clear distinction between a producer who writes and creates the music and an artist, typically a rapper, whose job is to A, write lyrics, and B, rap them. I believe David Byrne writes about this in the liner notes of the reissue of My Life in the Bush of Ghosts in a really clear and clever way. Given that Miseducation is not purely a hip-hop record and this doesn't hold, for example, I have not found anyone credited as a producer for Final Hour other than Lauryn Hill, so presumably she produced the beat and rapped over it. It makes terms like producer and writer more nebulous. As I mentioned earlier, where music intersects with copyright law is notoriously messy. From a Vice article from 2018 entitled The Music Industry's Miseducation About Black Women's Creative Ownership, Hill is quoted, "I hire master builders and masterful artisans and technicians who play beautifully, lend their technical expertise, and who translate the language that I provide into beautifully realized music. These are my songs. Musicians are brought in because of the masterful way that they play their instruments. No matter how incredible the musicians who play with me are, my name is on the marquee. The expectation to make it all come together is on me. The risk and the financial losses are on me. Hence, my vibe, though not the only consideration, is the priority. Few people actually know what this road is like, but many want to judge and comment having never done it. Try doing what I've done yourself. If nothing else, you will gain some insight into and respect for my process." That being said, the lawsuit was settled per Wikipedia for about $5 million, with Newark and the production and writing credits were amended in a few songs on the album to recognize their collaborative nature. I tend to think, not being privy to the hard evidence on either side, that the record is mostly Hill's, with a few instances where she should have been more generous with credit. I think, had there been a heavy-handed record producer telling her what to do, the first thing they would have done would have been to cut down some of the length, including axing most, if not all, of the skits. Why is this record number 1 on the list? A few reasons. Number 1, it has both antecedents and descendants. Look in the top 10 for clues. Amy Winehouse is ranked number 8 on the Apple Music list, and there's a direct line between this record and Winehouse's magnum opus and much better record, in my opinion, Back to Black. The title track, When It Hurts So Bad, and I Used to Love Him all sound like antecedents to Winehouse's sound, and it's not surprising to me, after hearing this record, to learn that Winehouse used to mash up Hill's doo-wop with her own songs. Ditto Stevie Wonder. If you're familiar with Stevie Wonder to any degree, you almost certainly thought of him while listening to Every Ghetto, Every City. If you have a record that can both look backwards to records you love and forwards to records you love, it places these things on a continuum that makes it easy to say, it takes things I like and builds on them and influenced future musicians. Critics love being able to say that. Lineage is important to musicians too. Number 2, I talked about it before. I think people love a story. The story of Hill going on her own and making a record by herself that spoke to many people was catnip to the Grammys and others. I also think she got nominated in a relatively weak year, and the ability for the Academy to award her as a hip-hop record let them off the hook for previous and future snubs in the genre. Number 3, Bono said something once that was, while being very douchey, also true. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something to the effect of, we, meaning you too, mix religion and spirituality in our music in a way that is rare in Western pop music. I think one of the appeals of the record was its religious themes, which are fairly rare in pop music. I think this expanded the audience, and people who were maybe wary of buying a hip-hop record found that they could get down with El Boogie's version of it, being infused with Christian allusions, songs about love, her kids, and childhood nostalgia. You may be saying to yourself, you talked a lot about non-music related things as to why people love this record. Are you saying that you hate it? No, I'm actually not saying that. I think the record is solid. It has a couple of singles, one of them better than the other, and a couple of other songs I would classify as good but not great. However, solid should not be confused with the greatest record of all time. I tend to be a contrarian by nature, but I don't think it takes a contrarian to question the placement here. Side note, I'm not going to go into how one would or should categorize greatness. I don't have that kind of time, but I think it would be interesting to know the reasons the judges ranked this record so highly. Spin magazine placed this record at number 28 for their list of 90 albums of the 1990s, which I don't have a major problem with. Are there records that are lower on the list that I think are better? Yes, but by not having it at number 1, I can chalk it all up to opinions that are different than mine and move on. Before I move on from Miseducation, I'm going to compare it to another record from the 90s that also has a ton of interpolation, Sublime's self-titled 1996 record. The biggest hits, Santeria, What I Got, Wrong Way, will be played on rock radio possibly forever. It also has found a new life with literally the lead singer's son playing songs that his father didn't get to tour on, having died of a heroin overdose. We also see influences in modern artists, including Lana Del Rey covering Doin' Time. As rock has waned in popular culture, there will probably never be a critical consensus this record is a top 100 record of all time because, as we've seen on this list, it doesn't fit neatly into any category. Is it a reggae record, a ska record, a rock record? And again, based on this list, top albums lists will increasingly be dominated by pop records of the day, pop artists of the past, and their direct antecedents. Another way of saying this, it's quite possible that London Calling will in the future be seen as the punk record, even though it's not really a punk record, and Nevermind will be seen as the grunge record, though there are other records that more purely capture that sound. If this is true, what does that mean for a similar list for 2044 or 2045? It's likely that the large number of hip-hop records from the late 1980s to the late 1990s will shrink down. More on that later. The list in 2044 will probably reflect the pop music at the time more than anything else. If, for instance, country music continues to grow in popularity and we have a string of critically acclaimed country records over the next decade or decade and a half, it's not inconceivable that one of them, or a record that has already been released, will move into the top 10. If we see a number of country records weighed as heavily as we saw hip-hop in this list, it's not out of the question that influences of these records, call them country crossovers, will make it into the top 100. If that happens, don't be surprised if we see Garth Brooks or Shania Twain, and possibly the record that he'll beat for Album of the Year, on this list in 20 years. If we see a collapse in hip-hop like we saw for the British invasion from 2003 to 2024, which hip-hop record survives? A lot of this will depend on what culture looks like over the next 20 years. If I had to pick just one record, however, I'd pick It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back by Public Enemy. Part of this is the critical acclaim of this record. As well as being on both of these lists, it's also on Paste Magazine's Top 300 Albums at number 11. Paste is probably somewhere between the voting block of both Rolling Stone and Apple in terms of age and gender taste. It's safe to say that this record is now part of the critically acclaimed canon. This is very important when looking towards the future. The past is predictive. At this point, it will take a nation of millions to kick Abbey Road or Pet Sounds out of the canon. For a longer look at how age and gender can affect how these lists can be impacted over time, I'll link to an article entitled What Makes an Album the Greatest of All Time by Chris Dalla Riva and Matthew Daniels. I think it's interesting to apply some of their findings to the Apple Music list. I'll let you do that at your own convenience. If in the future hip-hop is seen as an extension of the Black Civil Rights Movement, a record that Spin magazine once described as hip-hop as fierce Afrocentric theater would make a lot of sense. Also, it's my belief that sample-based production holds up better than keyboard and drum music-based production, so it's likely that this record will only sound better as sample-based production continues to be prohibitively expensive for many. For instance, Atrocity Exhibition by Danny Brown was critically lauded but did not earn its advance out in part due to the expense of the relatively few samples used. You may be asking yourself, what would an internet stranger do to try to synthesize these two lists and make them more acceptable? I'm glad you asked. I think recent pop artists and 90s hip-hop are too represented on the Apple list, and I think the British Invasion is probably too overrepresented on the Rolling Stone list. I take the 30 spots between 90s hip-hop and 2000s era pop and have a point system to get rid of half of them. The $100 test would work well here. With those 15 spots, I'd give Beggar's Banquet a spot, Graceland a spot, probably Elvis's self-titled record, something by Elvis Costello, This Year's Model maybe, and give a spot each to Chuck Berry and James Brown. With the rest of the spots, I try to round out genre misses and early 2000 albums that I feel got lost in the shuffle. Since I Left You by the Avalanches, Elephant by the White Stripes, Mad Villainy by Mad Villain, Jakarta 3 by Lil Wayne, and Merryweather Post Pavilion by Animal Collective, being the latter, with the former being Nevermind the Bullocks, Dookie, and Damaged. They aren't my genres, but I probably also have a record for prog rock, alt country, and something that came from the big beat of electronica. You've Come a Long Way Baby or Dig Your Own Hole are two choices. I'd give Paranoid by Sabbath a spot and switch out Led Zeppelin 2 for 4 as well. A question to ask when examining lists like this one: what is one album you would add and one you would subtract from this list? For me, the biggest snub was Paul Simon's Graceland. It does what I think of when I think of greatest albums. It's a nearly perfect record from beginning to end. It's one of the few records I knew all the words to. It's been critically acclaimed since it was released and is consistently on lists of best records except for this one. Did it have a huge musical influence that lasts to this day? Not really. I think it certainly brought attention to African musicians who before went unnoticed in most of the Western world, but I think the underlying idea of the record, a popular white male musician goes to Africa to create the music in various regional styles, probably would not be well received today, even if the end product was as great as this. This may be why the record didn't make the list. Also, the record has been plagued by accusations of plagiarism, though A, it should be noted that this was largely from Los Lobos, who Simon also recorded with for the record, and B, miscrediting didn't seem to stop the makers of the Apple list from giving Miseducation the top spot. I have a hunch that it's mostly that the makers of the list didn't care very much for white singer-songwriters, with the exceptions of Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen. The album I'd remove, Kid A. This is obviously a personal preference, but I've never gotten the Radiohead hype. They have 2 records on this list, and OK Computer is on the Rolling Stone list. Should Radiohead have 2 records when Led Zeppelin, Bob Dylan, and Bruce Springsteen don't? The answer is no. Overall, the Apple Music list is probably what one would expect when viewed through the lens of a multinational corporation that is positioning itself as cool, but not too cool, list makers with tastes more geared for Xers and their kids than professional music critics. When viewed through that lens, this list makes a ton of sense. It's not terrible, but it does feel like a kindergarten teacher going through the motions, making up awards and giving out trophies until all her students have won, more to avoid calls from those parents, and less like passionate people arguing about things that they love. Say what you will about Rolling Stone, they are stuck in the past. that Jan Werner has terrible taste and is a bad person, that the writing of their magazine is actually quite poor, whatever you want to say. They have stuck their flag in the ground and said, this is what is important to us, take it or leave it. I respect that, even if I don't worship the Beatles. Well, that's it. We've come to the end. I feel I've turned the horse into hamburger. I realize that music is very subjective and music fans tend to be incredibly passionate. If you disagree with my takes here, it's simply because you're wrong and I hate you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Elegant Ramblings. If you enjoyed what you've heard, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel on iTunes or YouTube. You'll be able to find show notes there. Hope you enjoyed. Bye for now.